I'll catch your worm for you. That is, if you're willing to pay.
No! You'll never get a cent out of me! Never! I'd rather that worm come in here right now and eat you all alive!
There's a question that children have been wondering for the last the last nearly 20 years. That's why today we're talking about just how much Mr. Krabs, owner and proprietor of the Krusty Krab, is worth. Let's start by trying to explain a couple things right off the bat. Believe it or not, a show that's been on as long as SpongeBob and that cares so incredibly little about continuity makes this kind of difficult. So it'll be sort of cherry picking certain events throughout the run of the show. And as we've seen throughout the series, Bikini Bottom seems to use dollars. So let's quickly look into where exactly Bikini Bottom is located. A popular theory is that Bikini Bottom is located somewhere underneath Bikini Atoll, and all the characters are some kind of radioactive creatures affected by the US's nuclear testing done there. This has, however, been more or less shot down by the voice of SpongeBob, with him stating that while Bikini Bottom was named for Bikini Atoll, the creatures definitely are not horribly radioactive monsters. So do we have any way to really prove just where it's actually located? Well, as a matter of fact, we do. Indulge me quickly as we travel back to the long lost year of 2002. A different time when Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man was a good performance and Avril Lavigne was a relevant topic. A special time when Nickelodeon was airing a set of very special Christmas bumpers. One you may remember being Plankton's holiday hits.
Oh, come, all ye fearful, cower as I crush you!
At the end of this, we see the majority of an address flash on the screen asking for the Krabby Patty formula to be mailed in as a payment for the CD. And right there, at the end we see it, Bikini Bottom, USA. So anyways, now on to Mr. Krabs. Eugene Krabs was born November 30th, 1942. He was raised in poverty, not even knowing what money was when he was younger. Eventually, Krabs and his former friend Plankton create the recipe for what would become the Krabby Patty later in his life. We know that at some point, Mr. Krabs joins the Navy for several years.
Holy fish paste! What is that?
That's the appetizer!
But I thought you said you were the head chef on the SS Gourmet.
Did I say that? No, I cleaned the bathrooms on the Gourmet. I was the head chef on the SS Diarrhea.
If he joins as soon as he turns 18, that would be 1960. There's also talk a few times through the series of Mr. Krabs having worked as a pirate at some time. Let's assume he worked for the Navy for 3 years before leaving to become a pirate. He would then spend the next 7 or so years as a pirate, making little to no actual money at the time. In fact, we know that he actually quits being a pirate and sells his pirate ship simply because he didn't feel as if he was making enough money. So now let's take a look at his pirate ship. We see that the ship has 2 masts, which means that the ship is not considered a sloop, which is just a ship with 1 mast. Doing some research, we can find out just how much a similar ship would be worth. With this, we can see that a recreation of Blackbeard's ship, Queen Anne's Revenge, would cost over $11 million. Because Mr. Krabs' ship is smaller, we'll assume that the ship itself is worth around $8 million today. Going back once again to look at the ship, we can see that there are 13 cannons on one side, meaning 26 cannons total. A typical cannon can go for $22,000. That means we can add an additional $572,000 onto the $8 million for the ship. And as stated earlier, we know that he hasn't made much money, if any, during his tenure as a pirate, considering that's the entire reason he quits being a pirate in the first place. So today, Mr. Krabs' ship would be worth a total of $8,572,000. But of course, we need to do some math to see just how much it would have been worth back in 1970. Doing that, we can see that Mr. Krabs would be able to sell his ship for $1,285,800. Now let's finally talk about the Rusty Krab. No, I didn't misspeak. Let's talk about the retirement home that would eventually become the Krusty Krab. Judging by how many people we see outside the Krusty Krab, and the fact that we're pretty familiar with the building's layout, we can assume the building would only cost around $500,000 back in 1970. So we'll take that away from Mr. Krabs' total he received from the boat, which means coming out of 1970, Mr. Krabs has a total of $785,800 in his bank account. And now let's talk about bank accounts. In one episode of SpongeBob, Mr. Krabs' mattress gets thrown away, and it's revealed that he actually keeps all his money tucked away there. But this directly contradicts several other episodes where we see Mr. Krabs sleeping on a hammock. This can just be chalked up to an inconsistency in the show, and as a result, we will be assuming that Mr. Krabs keeps his money in the bank, a surefire way to earn interest, something he would likely enjoy. Now let's move on to the actual business of the Krusty Krab. The easiest way to determine just how much Mr. Krabs was making per year is to see just how much he's made in total. We know that by Season 3's episode Clams that Mr. Krabs has earned $1 million total. His wording for this is very particular. He says that it is his 1 millionth dollar earned. Not stolen, not scammed, earned. Mr. Krabs has made $1 million total off of the restaurant. Doing some math, we can see that in order to have done this, he would be making an average of $31,250 per year before taxes. This would also be taking into account the minuscule salaries he pays his employees. We'll also assume that Mr. Krabs, ever the cheapskate, is saving 80% of his money each year. So going off of that math, from the time Mr. Krab opens the Krusty Krab until 1990, Mr. Krabs would have $2,002,600.70 saved up. 1990 is a big year for Mr. Krabs. Pearl, his daughter, is born. The average parent spends around $13,000 per year on a child. Despite Mr. Krabs being incredibly cheap, we've seen several instances throughout the show of him spoiling his daughter to some extent. So we'll be assuming he's spending around $10,000 a year on his daughter. This is actually the last major change in Mr. Krabs' spending habits in the series. While we see him try and make extra money through some devious plans, he typically just ends up breaking even. Let's look at a couple examples of this. In Season 2, Mr. Krabs tricks SpongeBob into catching all the wild jellyfish to make jelly patties. Any profit he would have made off their success goes into creating a factory to expedite the process, but the jellyfish are soon freed. In Season 6, Mr. Krabs tricks SpongeBob and Patrick into wrestling and winning a large sum of money, but they end up choosing to go to wrestling camp instead. In Season 7, Mr. Krabs uses Gary as a coin magnet and eventually begins basically stealing from people. However, he ends up in the hospital and uses all the money he's earned or stolen as a means to pay for the bill. There are a ton of other examples I could have used, but the fact remains that Mr. Krabs just isn't that good at getting away with his plans a lot of the time. There's something we still haven't talked about with Mr. Krabs: his home. The housing market in SpongeBob is weird to say the least. We've seen at one time SpongeBob has bought his house, and then another time it just kinda grew. We know that there are realtors in the series, but Patrick lives under a rock. Literally. And he has no income whatsoever, which means he has no way to pay for his house in any way, shape, or form. This tells me that in some cases, some citizens of Bikini Bottom just find a place and move in. Essentially just squatters. And weirdly enough, if someone squats for long enough and makes significant improvements to the building or lot, they can actually get legal possession of the property. This is something called adverse possession, and it's a really confusing legal gray area. But this honestly seems like something that Mr. Krabs would try to do. Considering that Mr. Krabs has been living in his anchor for the last roughly 40 years, he would likely be considered the owner of the property. So let's take a look at what his house has to offer. The right side of his house is Mr. Krabs' bedroom, the left side is Pearl's bedroom, and the second floor in the center is the master bathroom. The first floor contains the living room and kitchen. We've also seen that there is a basement, but we've also seen it look pretty different every time we've seen it. And finally, to figure out how much his house would be worth, we need to figure out how many citizens there are in Bikini Bottom. Bikini Bottom has at times been portrayed as very large and other times portrayed as tiny. For instance, during the Pretty Patties episode, SpongeBob attracts 46,853 customers, and in another episode we see a sign that says Bikini Bottom only has 500 residents. So what we're going to do is average the two numbers together and use that as a base for the population. The number we come out with is 23,677. A similar home in a similar market would go for around $79,000. But we also know that Mr. Krabs' house is extremely decorated and has a ton of furnishings. The average two-bedroom house is $37,172.39 in furnishings, but we'll take that up to $40,000 with what we've seen of Mr. Krabs' house. Now for the moment of truth. At the rate he was going, Mr. Krabs would have saved $5,258,025.13 in his bank account. His house would be worth $79,000 with $40,000 worth of furnishings. Now the Krusty Krab would be worth a considerable amount more than it was originally bought for, considering it's the most popular restaurant in Bikini Bottom. We'll estimate around $4 million when we take rising land values and the estimated business worth. So now we add everything up and see that Mr. Krabs, as of 2018, is worth $9,377,025.13. Which is probably a good thing. That kind of money means Mr. Krabs and the Krusty Krab will stay in business a long, long time. But anyways, this has been 10K Bill, and thanks for watching. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure you like this video, and if you have any ideas of what you'd like to hear me talk about next, comment that down below. And of course, make sure to subscribe for all your entertainment-related content.